I want to cross back into Sydney now and catch up with new Liberal Senator Andrew Bragg. Thanks for joining us again, Andrew. I want to talk about your pet subject of superannuation reform in a moment. But first up, a couple of announcements from the government today. $20 million to be tipped into the recycling industry. I mean, shouldn't they be able to stand on their own 2 feet?
Well, look, we always try and, do the right thing by the environment. I think that's a very important thing to do, Chris. So hopefully that will help us do that.
But I mean, we've got local governments who spend a fortune making sure we all have like 4 rubbish bins and, plastic recyclables, paper recyclables, green waste. We have state governments putting levies on containers so that we recycle them. Honestly, the industry gets a hell of a kickstart. It obviously hasn't been able to proceed in the way it would want, and now we have federal government tipping cash in as well.
Well, as you know, there are many industries that have a high level of intervention, and one of those, of course, is my old pet topic of super. I mean, it's often hard to see where the market starts and the government ends. So it's not unusual, Chris.
No, it is not unusual, but I'm anti-interventionist, so I'll keep raising that. And I suspect you're pretty anti-interventionist too. Just on that, another thing you would have focused on in previous roles before coming into Parliament, and everybody in Parliament is focused on it now, is infrastructure. We've actually got record infrastructure spending in this country at the moment. It's not a partisan thing. This has happened under Labor and Liberal governments, state and federal, but there's an amazing amount of infrastructure being rolled out. Yet Infrastructure Australia says it's not enough. We've got to sort of basically keep this rolling out for decades to come. Do you think they're right? Is this the only way to really make our economy more efficient long-term, is continue this record investment in infrastructure?
I mean, as you know, Chris, you live in New South Wales, so you know that we had 16 years of not building too much. And yet we have run quite a strong immigration program, and a lot of the immigration has ultimately gone to Melbourne and Sydney. So there is a huge backlog. In the future, we need to make sure that when we do run a strong migration program, which I personally support, that we also extend train lines, we build the roads, because we're trying to make up for, frankly, a lot of wasted time, especially in New South Wales. And for people who've driven through the M4 tunnel and whatnot, these projects can be transformational, so I think they're absolutely worth doing. Yeah,
we'll see what gives there, but interesting that we need to keep that spending up, apparently, according to Infrastructure Australia, and they're paid to give that independent advice. Now, let's get back to this issue of super. First up, Andrew, we've discussed this before, but the Prime Minister's effectively slapped you down, says that he's not changing the government's super policy. It's already legislated, and he doesn't want people like you continuing the debate. Are you defying him?
Well, as you know, the Treasurer's announced a retirement incomes review, and I think you're referring to some of the issues I raised in various speeches. My understanding is that this review will look at a lot of the issues that people have raised, and I think it's a good thing to have a policy debate, Chris, because we want the super system to work. We, as a government, invest heavily in the scheme. It's compulsory, and my view is it could work better.
Now, one of the ideas you've raised previously is that certainly for the legislated increase from 9.5% compulsory super to 12%, you'd like to make that voluntary for at least low-income workers. So is that now off the table, and you're talking about other reforms in the super sector?
Well, I gave a speech yesterday in Canberra where I talked about what I hope some of the things will be covered in the retirement incomes review. And I think that the 2 key questions, Chris, are if we have more super, will it get more people off the pension? And secondly, if we have more super, will it improve retirement outcomes? And I think these are good questions to ask. As I said, we heavily invest in the scheme. There's a lot of foregone income tax revenue. The fees in many cases are quite high. And so I think it's a good time to have this retirement review, which the Treasurer has flagged.
Yeah, well, let's talk about this because Paul Keating has come out to defending this plan. He was the architect of it, so we would expect that. He made some good points I'll put to you in a moment. Yep. But the critical thing, he never talks about the fact that it should stop people going on to the pension. And you unashamedly, and I think a lot of sensible people think that this program only really works if it allows people to provide for their own retirement, stops them going on to the pension. As it currently stands, would a person on average income putting only compulsory super in for their entire working life, would they accumulate enough to retire on and therefore not require the age pension?
No. The answer is no. If you go back and look at what Mr Keating said when the scheme was proposed in 91, it was certainly part of the scheme's design that people would become self-sufficient. They would get off the pension. And we know today about 80% of people will still take a pension, and that doesn't really change between now and mid-century. So the scheme can do more heavy lifting, partly through having reduced costs and being more efficient, but also how it interacts with pensions and other things, which I think is now going to be part of the retirement review. But, I mean, it's just not true to say that the ambition was so low to never get people off the pension. The ambition was always to get people off the pension.
Well, on the basic level, then, we should have a system where, on average, on an average income over your lifetime, you should be able to provide for your retirement. I mean, if you're not doing that at average levels, the system's not really going to be effective, is it?
And at the average level, I mean, you need a much higher contribution than even 12% to do that, Chris. So I think the whole idea that we don't... So I think we should encourage people to voluntarily save so they can be self-sufficient. And I think the industry ought to be more honest about what super is actually going to do for people. Now, there's no problem with people taking pensions, but I do think we want to get people more independent, especially as the population ages, and that demographic trend presents more problems for our budget.
Of course, public servants get 15%. Is that enough?
Look, for most people, and the actuaries will back this in, it's somewhere around 20% that you need over your working life to be totally self-sufficient the way that the current tax and social security laws work, yeah.
I'm going to have to get cracking in the next 30 or 40 years of my working life. Just one other thing I wanted to get your thoughts on, Andrew. I thought a strong point that Paul Keating made was the way this scheme has added to national savings, the trillions of dollars now invested in superannuation funds in Australia, and how this has helped the Australian economy from an investment point of view be much more self-reliant. Do you agree that that's been a transformative aspect of this policy and worth preserving?
Certainly the super system helped companies recapitalise during the financial crisis because there was more liquid capital. But I do think that there is a tendency within the industry to basically hug the index, and a lot of the products are very similar. So, I mean, I'd like to see a few more diverse offerings, and one thing we need to do is to legislate so more people have more choice, because at the moment there are laws in Australia which prevent people from choosing their own super fund, which I think is outrageous.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I appreciate it, and good luck with that review, Andrew.